In 1969, deep in Vietnam's Central Highlands, an American patrol stumbled onto an abandoned outpost. No gunfire, no bodies, no signs of battle, just a perfect ring of stones, scorched into the earth as if the jungle itself had erased every trace of human presence. To the soldiers, this place was green hell, a suffocating maze of snakes, parasites, and unseen death. But what terrified them most wasn't the terrain. It was the laughter echoing through the trees, the stones hurled from the ridgelines with sniper-like accuracy, and the eyes that watched without fear. This was not the Viet Cong. This was something else. A war the world never recorded, fought not for politics or power, but for territory older than mankind itself. They say in every war, the first enemy is the land itself. In Vietnam's Central Highlands, that truth was unavoidable. Soldiers called it green hell, not out of poetry, but out of sheer survival. The jungle here was not background. It was alive. It pressed against you, swallowed you whole, and reminded you every hour that you didn't belong. Picture it, a triple canopy so dense that sunlight never touched the ground. Noon looked like twilight, and even then, the air shimmered like a furnace. Temperatures climbed past 90 degrees. Humidity pushed the heat index over 110, and every breath felt like inhaling through a wet rag. The jungle didn't just surround you, it suffocated you. Boots rotted within weeks. Skin broke down into ulcers called jungle rot. Even the strongest men were reduced to ghosts, their bodies drained by malaria and dengue fever before they ever saw an enemy soldier. Every step carried risk. Roots coiled like vipers across the trail, and sometimes they actually were vipers. Bamboo concealed punji pits, spike traps that pierced boots and festered into deadly infections. Leeches dropped from branches. Mosquitoes carried parasites that no medic could cure. One Army medical report from 1968 summed it up in 3 chilling words. Disease is inescapable. Soldiers were warned about the 2-step crate and the white-lipped pit viper. If either struck, you had 2 steps before collapse, maybe 10 before death. Navigation was a nightmare. Compass needles spun without warning. Maps meant little because rivers cut through the valleys in twisting veins, changing course after every monsoon. Landmarks disappeared in weeks beneath new growth. Only a handful of dirt tracks crossed this wilderness, and most of them were mined, ambushed, or already controlled by the Viet Cong. For Americans dropped into this environment, it wasn't just enemy fire they feared, it was the silence, because silence meant something was watching. Veterans recall how animals always betrayed the coming of battle. Birds fled before artillery frogs went quiet before a mortar strike. But in the highlands, there were nights when everything stopped. Not because of soldiers, not because of gunfire, but because the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. And that was when men began to feel the weight of eyes. To the U.S. military, this was closed terrain, a sterile phrase for a nightmare landscape. Visibility collapsed to a few yards. Helicopter reconnaissance struggled to pierce the canopy. Radio signals dissolved into static. Entire patrols moved like blind men through a labyrinth designed not for humans, but for creatures older than history. Some soldiers broke down under the strain. Others adapted, developing a 6th sense for reading shadows, listening for shifts in the rhythm of the forest. But even the sharpest men admitted something unnerving. The jungle seemed to study them back. Leaves rustled where no wind blew. Stones shifted where no boots stepped. And sometimes when the fog lifted, men swore they saw figures upright, broad-shouldered, too fast, too deliberate to be tricks of the eye. At first, officers dismissed it. Nerves, exhaustion, shadows. But the reports repeated themselves. Different units, different nights, the same story movement in the brush, too quick to track, too upright to ignore. And then came the rocks. Stones hurled from ridgelines with precision that no random landslide could explain. The jungle had always been cruel. Now, it was tactical. For many soldiers, their first real enemy wasn't the Viet Cong. It was this suffocating wilderness that seemed to reject them at every turn. And yet the deeper they pushed into it, the more they realized the land wasn't just dangerous, it was defended. Something was out there, something that used the jungle not as camouflage, but as its natural kingdom. And that realization changed everything. Because if the jungle itself was the first enemy, then maybe it wasn't the only one. The Central Highlands had already broken men with its heat sickness and silence. But the night one squad first heard the laughter, the war took on a new, impossible shape. It began like any other night patrol. A platoon had dug in along a ridgeline watching the valley below for enemy movement. The jungle lay heavy around them, branches sagging with mist, insects buzzing like static. And then, without warning, the forest went still. No frogs, no cicadas, no owls, just silence. Veterans later said silence in the jungle was never empty. It was a presence. It meant the jungle was waiting. That's when it came. A laugh, not a chuckle, not the kind of laughter men exchange over a joke, but something deeper, thick, heavy. It rolled down the slope in waves, bouncing between the trees until no one could tell its source. Every man froze, rifles raised, eyes wide. This wasn't the cackle of soldiers playing tricks. It wasn't the taunt of the Viet Cong. It was something else entirely. Seconds later, a stone whistled through the dark and slammed into the dirt at their feet. Then another. This time it hit a helmet, knocking a soldier back. The squad braced for gunfire, expecting an ambush, but none came. Just more stones, fist-sized, hurled with deliberate force from somewhere unseen above. And then silence again. At first, the higher command dismissed the report. Stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even the Viet Cong using psychological tricks. But soldiers on the ground knew better. The sound of that laughter didn't leave them. Men who had survived firefights, men hardened against the screams of battle, admitted this shook them to their core. Because laughter in that place meant intelligence, and intelligence meant they weren't just fighting the jungle anymore. Something was inside it, watching them, taunting them, testing how far they would go. The pattern repeated. Different platoons, different nights, always the same sequence. The forest goes silent, then stones, and sometimes that terrible laughter. One corporal described it years later with a trembling voice. It wasn't human. It was too heavy, too low. It felt like the jungle itself was laughing at us. This was more than nerves. Multiple units filed after-action reports describing accurate stone throwing from uphill positions. Stones traveling with such speed that men compared it to incoming artillery. One veteran said a rock smashed into his shoulder so hard he thought he'd been shot. Another swore the stone that hit him was as big as a football. These weren't random slides of loose rock. They were projectiles aimed, timed, and executed with intent. And still, there were no shell casings. No footprints, no signs of enemy withdrawal, just scattered stones and shaken men. The soldiers did what soldiers do. They fought back. Some began throwing the stones back into the brush, taunting whatever lurked there. But this only escalated the encounters. Rocks came back harder, faster, striking with almost mocking precision, as if whatever was out there understood the challenge and was more than willing to answer it. At this point, men started giving the phenomenon a name. They called them rock apes. Not out of humor, but because they didn't know what else to call them. Upright shapes, broad-shouldered, darting through the foliage, too fast to target, too deliberate to ignore, and always that sense of being watched, not by prey, not by predators, but by something studying them with unnerving patience. The impact of these encounters wasn't just physical, it was psychological. War is supposed to be clear enemy and ally bullets and blood, but here soldiers felt like pawns in someone else's game, toyed with by an adversary that didn't need rifles to dominate the battlefield. And this wasn't just one unit, or one unlucky patrol. Accounts came from multiple brigades, the 101st Airborne, the 173rd, even Marines from Task Force Delta. Different men, different missions, but the same chilling detail. Stones from the darkness and something standing just beyond the edge of vision. For many, this was the breaking point. Because if laughter echoed in the jungle, and if stones could fly with that kind of power, then it meant something unthinkable. They were not at the top of the food chain. The Vietnam War was already brutal. Jungle warfare was already a nightmare. But the soldiers began to realize that what hunted them in those ridgelines wasn't just human opposition. It was older, more primal. It didn't follow rules of engagement. It didn't care about borders or politics. And worse still, it didn't fear them. Veterans would later describe that realization as the moment everything changed. The jungle wasn't empty, it was occupied. And whatever lived there was sending a message, "You don't belong here." That first laugh was more than a sound, it was a warning. And by ignoring it, the soldiers had stepped into a war they could never win. For soldiers in Vietnam, ambush meant one thing: gunfire. It meant the crack of AK-47s, the hiss of mortars, the sudden eruption of jungle into chaos. But in the Central Highlands, ambush took on a different face. One that carried no bullets, no shrapnel, only stones. It began like every other contact report. A platoon moving along a narrow ridge. Shadows pressed in on all sides, visibility collapsing to just a few feet. They expected an ambush. They expected the familiar rhythm of incoming fire. Instead, the jungle answered with silence. And then, with a sudden crash, a rock the size of a man's fist struck the ground just in front of the point man. The squad froze. Another rock followed, smashing into a helmet and staggering the soldier backward. No gunfire, no enemy visible, just stones falling with frightening accuracy, one after another from the ridgeline above. At first, they thought it must be coincidence, loose debris shaken by movement. But the pattern was too precise. Each stone landed close. Each one seemed thrown with intent. Within minutes, the entire patrol was under bombardment. Dozens of rocks rained down in sequence, arcing through the foliage as if directed by unseen hands. One soldier took a direct hit to the ribs and collapsed, gasping for air. Another had his shoulder dislocated when a grapefruit-sized stone slammed into him. Radios lit up with panic. "We're under attack. Request fire mission." But air reconnaissance confirmed what the men on the ground already knew. There were no enemy fighters in the area, no muzzle flashes, no footprints, only scattered stones marking where something had been. The after-action report filed later carried the bland phrase, "enemy harassment." But the men knew harassment when they felt it. This was more than harassment. It was domination. Whoever or whatever had targeted them had chosen its range, chosen its victims, and then melted away before the soldiers could respond. And respond they tried. Some troops hurled stones back into the jungle, half in anger, half in desperation. But it only escalated the assault. Rocks came back harder, faster, each impact landing closer to the soft spots of their formation. One Marine would later recall, "It was like playing catch with someone who never missed and who wanted to hurt you with every throw." The psychological effect was devastating. These were combat-hardened men trained to respond to bullets with bullets, to meet violence with superior firepower. But here, their rifles felt useless. They were pinned down not by lead or steel, but by stones thrown with uncanny accuracy from an enemy they could not see. And the strangest part, the attackers never pressed the advantage. They didn't charge. They didn't finish the ambush with firepower. Once the point had been made, the stones stopped. The jungle went quiet again, as if satisfied. Soldiers were left shaken, humiliated, and forced to consider the unthinkable that they had just been toyed with. Reports of these stone ambushes spread quickly between units. The 101st Airborne, the 173rd, Marines from Task Force Delta, different brigades, different patrols, same eerie encounters, stones falling like mortars, men injured but no enemy body to show for it. Around the mess halls, whispers turned into a kind of reluctant folklore. They weren't fighting the Viet Cong out there. They were being tested by something else. What made it worse was the tactical consistency. The attacks followed rules, always from the high ground, always at night or in heavy mist, never a single stone, always a sequence measured deliberate escalating only when soldiers retaliated. This wasn't random behavior. it was strategy. For men trained to analyze enemy tactics, that realization was chilling. Tactics meant planning. Planning meant intelligence. And intelligence meant the rock apes, as they were now being called, weren't just animals flinging debris. They were adversaries in their own right, capable of reading a battlefield and using it against armed troops. One sniper put it best. He said it felt like looking through his scope, only to realize someone else was already looking back at him. I was hunting, he admitted, but I felt hunted. Whoever was out there knew exactly where I was, and they didn't care that I had the rifle. The jungle had become a chessboard, and the soldiers realized they were no longer the players. They were the pieces. By the time dawn broke after these encounters, patrols staggered back to their bases, bruised and bewildered. Their commanders demanded details. Where was the enemy? How many? What weapons? The answers never satisfied. No enemy, no weapons, just rocks. And yet the bruises were real. The concussions were real. The fear, most of all, was real. Men who had stared down machine gun nests admitted this was worse. Because with bullets, you at least knew your opponent. You knew where to aim. But when the jungle itself seemed to throw its weight against you, there was nowhere to point your rifle, nowhere to return fire. That was the lesson of the stone ambushes. This wasn't combat. It was a warning. A message written not in blood, but in bruises. You are not in control here. And that message carried forward, leading to the next escalation, the night when rocks alone would no longer be enough. When an entire unit would find itself surrounded, besieged, and left with the terrifying realization that the jungle didn't just resist them, it rejected them. In every soldier's mind, the word ambush meant one thing: gunfire. The sudden snap of AK-47s, the hiss of mortars, the chaos of explosions ripping through the trees. But in Vietnam's Central Highlands, there came a night when the word took on a new meaning, one stripped of bullets, but no less terrifying. A patrol was moving cautiously along a narrow ridge near Kontum. The jungle pressed close, so dense that even moonlight struggled to cut through. Every step was careful, every sound magnified. They expected contact with Viet Cong. Instead, the forest went silent. Too silent. Then, without warning, a stone the size of a man's fist hurtled out of the darkness and slammed into the dirt only a few feet from the point man. The squad froze. Soldiers dropped low, scanning the tree line, waiting for the inevitable crack of rifles. But it didn't come. Instead, another rock followed, this one smashing into a helmet with enough force to stagger the man backward. Before they could regroup, more stones began to fall, not rolling from a slope, not random debris shaken loose, but arcing deliberately through the canopy. Within moments, the unit was under bombardment. Rocks rained down in rhythm, dozens of them, each one landing close, each one aimed. One soldier's ribs snapped when a stone struck his chest. Another's shoulder dislocated under the impact of a grapefruit-sized projectile. Radios came alive with panic. "We're under attack. Request immediate fire mission." But when reconnaissance scanned the area, they found nothing. No muzzle flashes, no footprints, no enemy at all. Only scattered stones marking where something had stood. The official language that later appeared in the report was sterile enemy harassment. But for the men on that ridge, it wasn't harassment. It was humiliation. They were being pinned down, not by bullets or mortars, but by rocks, and whoever was throwing them wasn't missing. Some of the younger troops, half in desperation, half in defiance, threw the stones back. But this only made things worse. The next wave came faster, harder, and with terrifying precision. One Marine would later describe it as playing catch with an invisible pitcher who never missed and who seemed determined to hurt you every time. What shook the soldiers wasn't just the injuries, it was the tactics. These weren't animals scattering rocks in panic. The ambushes followed rules. The attackers used high ground. They struck at night when visibility collapsed. They escalated only when provoked. And then once their point was made, they stopped. No pursuit, no finishing blow, just silence. As if the jungle had decided to let them go this time. The realization was chilling, because tactics meant planning. Planning meant awareness. Awareness meant intelligence. And that suggested something unthinkable. They weren't fighting random wildlife. They were facing an adversary that understood the battlefield almost as well as they did. One sniper from the 101st later admitted he felt as if someone was mirroring him. "I was glassing the tree line, waiting for movement," he recalled, "and I swear something was already watching me through the leaves. Not prey, not a panicked animal, something that knew exactly where I was and didn't care that I had the rifle." These encounters spread quickly between units. The 173rd Airborne, Marines from Task Force Delta, stories told in mess halls, whispered over field radios. Rocks falling like mortars, men injured, no enemy visible. A new word spread among the ranks, rock apes, not as a joke, but as the only label they could grasp for shapes they glimpsed in the shadows, broad-shouldered, upright, too quick and deliberate to dismiss as hallucinations. The deeper analysis came later when veterans compared notes. The rock ambushes were always surgical, never random. They weren't designed to wipe out squads. They were designed to send a message. Rocks to bruise, not bullets to kill. Stones aimed at helmets, shoulders, supply crates, not slaughter warning. That insight disturbed the men most of all. Because it suggested something even darker, these encounters weren't about survival, they were about control. Whoever or whatever launched those ambushes wasn't afraid of American firepower. They were asserting dominance, reminding even heavily armed soldiers that rifles and mortars meant nothing against an enemy that refused to reveal itself. By dawn, the patrols limped back to base, battered and shaken. Commanders demanded details. How many attackers? What weapons? Where did they retreat? The answers came back the same every time. No attackers, no weapons, just rocks. But the bruises were real, the concussions were real, the fear that lingered in men who'd already faced machine gun nests and artillery was very real. Because they understood perhaps more than their commanders what had just happened. This wasn't combat, it was a warning. A reminder carved in bruises and broken bones that they were intruders, playing by rules that weren't theirs. And the jungle wasn't done. The stones were only the beginning. The next encounters would prove far worse, because if the jungle could warn, it could also punish. Long before the first American boots touched the Central Highlands, the people who lived there already knew the forest was not empty. To the Montagnard tribes, the Jirai Banar, and others who had walked those ridgelines for centuries, the jungle was alive, aware, and guarded by beings older than war. When U.S. patrols limped back from rock ambushes, battered and shaken, some turned to their local guides for answers. They expected explanations about Viet Cong tricks or hidden enemy units. Instead, they were met with solemn warnings. "Do not follow the echo of stones," one elder said, "because those stones do not belong to you." Another spoke more bluntly. "These are the forest people. Disturb them, and they will answer." The words unsettled soldiers more than they admitted. These weren't stories told for entertainment. They weren't campfire legends to scare children. They were delivered as matter-of-fact truths, spoken with the same certainty as warnings about vipers or punji pits. To the locals, the existence of the forest people known in some dialects as Batut was not a possibility. It was a fact. At first, many Americans laughed it off. In their minds, this was Bigfoot talk native superstition dressed up as survival lore. But laughter faded when details aligned too closely with their own experiences. The Montagnards described upright figures covered in reddish hair, with long arms and black intelligent eyes. They threw stones they struck from high ground, and they never attacked without cause. They studied intruders first, retaliated only when provoked, and then vanished into the jungle without a trace. Sound familiar? To the veterans who had felt the bruises on their shoulders, who had heard the laughter echo through the night, the descriptions were chillingly precise. Different language, same story. This forced some soldiers to confront an uncomfortable question. If the locals had always known about these beings, why hadn't anyone listened? Why did American command dismiss repeated warnings as folklore when the evidence, broken bones, smashed crates, stone bombardments lay in plain sight? The deeper truth was cultural. For the Montagnards, the forest people were not cryptids or monsters. They were guardians, part of the natural order. The jungle provided food, water, shelter, but only if respected. Violate that balance, and the guardians would act. To outsiders, this sounded mystical. To those who lived there, it was simply law. One American interpreter later recalled a phrase that haunted him for decades. A village elder told him, "The jungle eats sound, eats noise, but it keeps echoes. Someday those echoes return." At the time, the young interpreter had no idea what it meant. Years later, after hearing countless veterans describe stone ambushes, laughter in the dark, and patrols that never returned, the words finally made sense. Still, military command had no interest in local wisdom. Manuals didn't include sections on forest people. Strategy demanded tangible enemies, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese Army. Anything else was distraction. Reports mentioning rock apes or unexplained ambushes were edited down or quietly shelved. Soldiers who insisted on telling the truth risked being ridiculed or accused of losing their grip under stress. Yet in the field, the warnings spread anyway. Guides whispered them before night patrols. Interpreters repeated them in hushed tones. Even American squad leaders started passing them down. If the jungle goes silent, stay sharp. If you hear stones, don't throw them back. The irony wasn't lost on the veterans. They came to Vietnam armed with the most advanced weapons in the world, helicopters, napalm artillery. And yet here they were, relying on tribal wisdom older than their own country just to make it through the night. The lesson was unsettling but undeniable. The locals had lived alongside these beings for generations and survived. The Americans, arrogant in their firepower, had barged in and paid the price. For some, the realization shifted how they saw the war entirely. Maybe it wasn't just a fight against communism. Maybe it wasn't even about territory. Maybe it was a test of respect, one that the jungle's guardians enforced without mercy. And as word spread, soldiers began to notice patterns they'd ignored before. Villages abandoned overnight without signs of battle. Stone piles deliberately stacked near rivers. Burned clearings where patrols had vanished. Suddenly, every unexplained mystery in the highlands seemed connected. Not random accidents of war, but messages, warnings, written not in words but in silence, stone, and fear. The question was no longer whether the forest people existed. The question was how long they would tolerate being disturbed. And soon, the soldiers would find out, because warnings ignored eventually become consequences. And in one infamous siege on a hilltop choked with mist, the guardians of the jungle would show exactly how far they were willing to go. Warnings could be ignored, whispers could be dismissed. But the night of the siege erased all doubt. It happened in early spring of 1966 near a high ridge west of Dong Den Mountain, a zone notorious for ambushes and strange interference with radios. A reconnaissance team from the 3rd Marine Division was ordered to patrol the area. The mission was routine hike in observe report. Within 48 hours, routine had turned into nightmare. At first, it was movement in the brush, too fast, too upright, circling the perimeter. Marines prepared for enemy contact, expecting Viet Cong scouts. But when the shapes revealed themselves, they weren't men. Through the mist, figures stood broad-shouldered and shaggy, nearly a dozen of them. One Marine radioed in, voice tight, "Not VC, not locals, not anything I've ever seen." Command's response was strict. "Do not engage. Maintain silence." But silence didn't last. The first stone came heavy and flat, striking a supply crate with such force it split the wood clean in half. Then another, and another. Within seconds, rocks were raining down on their position with terrifying accuracy. Helmet dents, broken bones, crates shattered like kindling. Marines begged for permission to return fire. Denied. Gunfire could reveal their position. The order was clear hold. What happened next pushed them past breaking. From higher up the ravine, massive boulders began to tumble, some estimated at over 300 pounds. They didn't roll randomly. They were launched with purpose, slamming into trees, toppling branches, carving fresh scars into the hillside. One Marine shouted over the chaos, "This isn't combat. This is artillery with hands." The Marines were trapped. Every attempt to regroup was met with another wave of stones. Radios crackled with static, supplies overturned, men huddled in defensive crouches as rocks hammered down. For over an hour, the unit endured the onslaught. One man was knocked unconscious, another dragged away into the brush. His body was never recovered. By the time helicopters arrived for extraction, the hillside looked like a battlefield. Craters pocked the slope, drag marks streaked through the mud, blood stained the rocks. The Marines had survived, but they hadn't won. The enemy hadn't fired a single bullet, and yet they had dominated the fight. What terrified the survivors most wasn't just the strength of the attack, it was the strategy. These beings hadn't charged blindly. They had surrounded, measured, and punished the intruders without ever revealing themselves fully. Soldiers used to ambushes from disciplined Viet Cong units admitted this felt different, more personal, more ancient. Back at base, the event was filed away as enemy harassment, but the men who were there gave it another name, the siege. And it left a scar not only on their bodies, but on their understanding of the war. Because that night proved something chilling. The jungle didn't just resist, it rejected. And if rocks could shatter steel crates and bones alike, what would happen when warnings turned to retaliation? The Marines who endured the siege near Dongden returned shaken, battered, and silent. They expected their testimonies to change everything, to spark new tactics, new warnings, maybe even official investigations. Instead, their words were erased. The official after-action file contained nothing about boulders, nothing about laughter, nothing about figures on the ridge. It was stamped with a single phrase, enemy harassment. That was the end of it. But the men knew what they had lived through, and they couldn't reconcile it with the paperwork. One sergeant described his frustration years later. If it had been VC, we'd have chased them, tracked them, found bodies. But there was nothing, just rocks. And the report said we'd been hit with mortars. That's a lie. I know the difference between shrapnel and stone. It wasn't an isolated incident. Patrols across the Highlands filed similar accounts. Accurate stone-throwing ambushes without gunfire, upright shapes, glimpsed in the mist. Yet each time the reports reached higher command, the language was sanitized. Enemy harassment, psychological stress, misidentification, anything but the truth. Why part of it was bureaucracy, the U.S. Military had no section in its manuals for unidentified hominids, no protocol for forest guardians. War demanded clarity, friend or foe, win or lose. Admitting that an unknown force was targeting soldiers would only raise questions without answers, questions the Pentagon wasn't prepared to face. But another part was pride. How could the most advanced military on Earth, armed with helicopters, napalm, and artillery, admit it had been driven back by stones? To acknowledge such encounters wasn't just unhelpful, it was humiliating. Easier to bury the reports than to admit that power meant nothing against an unseen adversary. So the stories lived only in whispers, around mess halls, in the barracks, at veteran reunions years later where drinks loosened tongues, but the fear never faded. Men compared bruises, shared the details, scrubbed from official files. They realized the patterns lined up too neatly to dismiss. One Marine summed it up bluntly. You can hide it in the paperwork. You can call it whatever you want. But we know what happened out there. We know what threw those rocks. The disappearance of these reports didn't erase the encounters. It only deepened the mystery. If entire units across multiple divisions experienced the same phenomenon, how could they all be wrong? Were thousands of soldiers hallucinating in perfect coordination? Or was something real being deliberately hidden? And then came the strangest twist of all. As rumors spread, veterans began to hear that North Vietnamese troops had filed reports strikingly similar to their own patrols, stalked stones raining down from ridgelines, soldiers vanishing without explanation. The implication was chilling. This wasn't one side's imagination. This was a common enemy. One neither side could explain and one both sides quietly feared, which meant the war the world remembers wasn't the only war being fought in the Highlands. There was another front line, one that belonged not to men, but to the jungle itself, Wars are built on divisions, us versus them, one flag against another. But in the Central Highlands, something happened that shattered that simple equation. For the first time, both sides began whispering the same story. American veterans weren't the only ones reporting stone ambushes, eerie laughter, and shadows standing upright in the mist. North Vietnamese soldiers described it too. Intercepted communications mentioned spirit attacks on patrols, strange losses in mountain regions where no U.S. units were operating, and reports of men vanishing without gunfire. Outposts found circled by stones. Radio operators swore they heard pacing outside the wire, only to find nothing but crushed vegetation and scattered rocks at dawn. At first, American command dismissed it as propaganda tales invented to frighten or distract. But then the details lined up too perfectly. The timing, the locations, the tactics, stones from elevation ambushes without bullets, and sudden disappearances in the jungle, silence. It mirrored everything American soldiers had already experienced themselves. That realization cut deep. The Viet Cong were skilled, ruthless, and disciplined. But they were human. These encounters didn't feel human. They felt older. Something both armies had stumbled into, but neither controlled. For U.S. soldiers hardened by combat, the thought was unsettling enough. For North Vietnamese fighters steeped in a culture of folklore and spirits, the encounters carried an even heavier weight. Many began to avoid certain ridges, whispering the name the locals had used for generations, Batut, the forest people. Not enemy, not ally, simply guardians of the land who recognized no side, no politics. The irony was stark. Two armies locked in brutal conflict, slaughtering each other for territory, yet both secretly dreading the same presence. A presence that belonged to neither side, but to the jungle itself. In whispered conversations, some veterans admitted a strange sense of kinship. One American recalled, "For a moment, I almost felt like the NVA were on our side. Because whatever was out there, it didn't care about communism or democracy, it just wanted us all gone." This common enemy forced a new way of thinking. If the encounters were real, and too many men swore they were, then the war in Vietnam wasn't just between nations. It was layered, complicated, a clash between human ambition and something far more ancient. The guns, the napalm, the uniforms, none of it mattered to the watchers in the trees. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps these encounters were a reminder that war itself was irrelevant to the land. The forest had survived empires before. It would survive superpowers now. The Guardians weren't fighting for ideology. They were defending memory. The memory of a place that belonged to itself long before men carved borders into maps. By the late 1960s, this quiet realization spread through the ranks. Soldiers didn't speak of it in official briefings, but around campfires, in whispered exchanges between former enemies years later, the truth remained the same. In those hills, you weren't American or North Vietnamese. You were just a trespasser. And if both sides could feel it, then perhaps the war wasn't just being fought above ground. Perhaps it was being judged by something far older than politics and far less forgiving. For the Montagnard tribes who had lived in the highlands for centuries, none of this was new. To them, the figures in the mist, the stones hurled from ridgelines, and the sudden silences of the jungle were not mysteries. They were warnings. The elders had always spoken of the Batut, the forest people. Not ghosts, not monsters, guardians. They were described as tall, broad-shouldered beings covered in reddish-brown hair with long arms and dark, intelligent eyes. They watched outsiders carefully. They tolerated them only so long as the rules of the forest were respected. But break those rules, and the guardians would retaliate, not with blind rage, but with precision. Children grew up hearing these lessons. Never follow the echo of a stone. When the jungle goes silent, stop, because something is walking that does not walk on four legs. These weren't fairy tales. They were survival instructions passed down through generations. For locals, the existence of the forest people wasn't a question. It was part of life, as real as the monsoons or the snakes. American soldiers who listened to these stories often dismissed them at first. They thought of Sasquatch legends back home, of campfire tales meant to spook. But the more they compared the details, the harder it became to laugh. Every buoy, every warning matched what patrols had already reported. The laughter, the stones, the presence in the trees. Different culture, same encounters. And that raised an unsettling truth. The soldiers thought they had discovered something new in the jungle. In reality, they had simply walked into an old story, one that predated their war by centuries. What they called rock apes, the tribes had already named Batut. Where Americans filed after-action reports, villagers left offerings at the edge of the forest. Both sides acknowledged the same force. One with paperwork, the other with ritual. It changed how some men saw the conflict. The war they were fighting, communism versus democracy, North versus South, suddenly seemed small, petty. Because beneath the gunfire there was a deeper war playing out, one between mankind's ambition and nature's guardianship. The Batu weren't choosing sides. They weren't defending ideology. They were defending the land itself. One American interpreter remembered a phrase from a village elder that haunted him long after he left Vietnam. The jungle eats noise, but it keeps echoes. And someday those echoes return. At the time, he thought it was poetry. Later, after hearing veterans recall the same chilling encounters, he realized it was prophecy. The guardians weren't attacking randomly. They were answering. For the Montagnards, this balance was sacred. The forest provided food, water, medicine, life. But only when treated with respect. War violated that balance. Artillery shredded it, napalm scarred it, and the guardians responded the only way they knew, with warnings that grew sharper every time they were ignored. This message lingered with veterans long after they returned home. They had entered Vietnam believing the enemy wore uniforms and carried rifles. But in the highlands, they discovered another truth. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not a man at all, but a memory that refuses to be erased. And that memory was about to take shape one final time as the jungle itself delivered its verdict, not through whispers or legends, but through fear carved into silence. By the early 1970s, as American forces prepared to withdraw, the encounters faded. The stones stopped falling. The laughter died away. The forest grew quiet again. Commanders welcomed the silence, assuming the strange reports had been exaggerations, or that the creatures, if they ever existed, had retreated deeper into the mountains. But for the men who had lived through it, the quiet felt different. It wasn't relief. It was absence, like something had chosen to step back, watching, waiting. Veterans carried that silence home with them. At reunions decades later, men would speak in low voices about what they had seen. They didn't sound like conspiracy theorists. They sounded like survivors, trying to make sense of a war that had played by rules no manual prepared them for. They spoke of rocks thrown with sniper-like precision, of eyes reflecting from the tree line of patrols, swallowed without a single shot fired. None of it made it into official records, but it lived on in memory, and memory, like the jungle, does not forget. Some researchers later speculated that what soldiers encountered were relic hominids, survivors of species science believed extinct. Others framed it as folklore, manifesting under the pressure of war. But to those who felt the bruises, who heard the laughter in the mist, the explanations didn't matter. What mattered was the unmistakable sense that the war had disturbed something far older than politics, and that it had chosen to remind intruders of their place. What unsettled men most was not the violence, but the restraint. The rock apes or forest people could have killed more. They didn't. Instead, they warned. They punished. They made their presence undeniable, but never fully revealed themselves. That pattern suggested something terrifying. They weren't afraid. They tolerated soldiers until they didn't. And when the line was crossed, they acted with the precision of guardians protecting sacred ground. To this day, hikers and border patrols in the Central Highlands occasionally report footprint stone piles or eerie screams that echo through the valleys. The war has ended, but the jungle has not changed. Some territories do not forgive. Some front lines never close, and some watchers never blink. For the veterans, the message remained clear. They had entered Vietnam believing the enemy wore uniforms, carried rifles, and fought for ideology. But in the end, they discovered a deeper truth. The jungle itself was a battlefield, and its guardians were older than any flag. Perhaps that is why the story still lingers, passed quietly between those who served. Because deep down, every man who walked those ridgelines knows the truth. They weren't just fighting a war. They were trespassing in a memory that refused to be conquered. So the next time you find yourself in the woods surrounded by silence so complete, it feels alive. Ask yourself, is it just quiet, or is something still watching, waiting for you to cross the line?